So Lombardi takes the New York Giants assistant coaching job in 1954. The game was right on the precipice of breaking out, as it was just 4.5 years until the groundbreaking 1958 NFL championship game that put pro football on the map. Bigger and better things were coming for the NFL and Lombardi. It was right before he got the job that the New York Daily News released a piece that was so inaccurate it bordered an unintentional comedy. It ran with the headline, "Giants boot Owen upstairs, Lombardi seeing new coach." It stated he was born in Brooklyn, raised in Inglewood, and at Fordham made the dean's list 4 straight years and had 2 years of postgraduate study. Every single one of those comments, other than the place where he was born, was wrong. Lombardi was never considered for the head coaching spot, although his getting hired by the Giants as an assistant was a big step. And the Murrahs seemed to provide a good atmosphere despite the misgivings Lombardi would have while working with the Giants. Tim Murrah, the father of Wellington and the founder of the Giants, would often dine with Lombardi, where Vince would discuss his family problems and receive advice. There is one issue I wanted to clear up. Yes, Wellington had gone to Fordham with Lombardi, however, they were not super close in college. Rather than some deep established relationship, it would seem to better describe it as a case of they knew of each other. In fact, when Murrah interviewed Lombardi for the job at the Beer Mountain Inn, this may have been the first time the two had been around each other since the mid-1930s. Lombardi, disappointed at the prospect of once again not getting a head coaching position, opted to take the job anyway when West Point coach Red Blake turned down his request for a raise. "Another $1,000 would have me at West Point," he would later say. This historical what-if may have turned out very bad for Lombardi, as while Blake liked him, he turned down Lombardi's overtures for head coach when he retired after the 1958 season. So where would he have gone then? The longer Lombardi stayed just as an assistant head coach, the longer he would run the risk of continuing to be typecasted as just an assistant. And one of the things that helped the momentum of Lombardi with the Giants was the fact he won a championship with them. While Army's last year under Blake was successful, finishing at number 3 in the country, unlike the Giants, they didn't capture the top spot, so the spotlight wouldn't be on him as much. One of the main advantages and the key to the Giants' success during this period was that their new head coach, Jim Lee Howe, didn't micromanage Lombardi or the other Giants' new assistant coach, Tom Landry. Instead, he let them do their own thing, and this autonomy provided a kind of quasi-head coaching experience for Vince before his time with the Packers. O'Brien makes the claim it was Howe's background in World War II as a Marine captain that formed a stance in delegating authority. Howe had played for the Giants before getting swept up in the war, before returning to the Giants to finish up his playing career, and now he was helming the squad, assisted by 2 future Hall of Fame coaches. So Lombardi was sent down to Arkansas to get to know Coach Howe and his farm outside of Lanoke. There, Howe fed him a freshly shot wild duck and rice, which Lombardi seemed to really like, as, according to Howe, he kept on saying, "You can't buy anything like this anywhere." In regard to Lombardi and Landry and their differing philosophies in coaching, Wellington stated, "You could hear Vince laughing or shouting for 5 blocks. You couldn't hear Landry from the next chair." They seemed to get along though, and Landry would later write that Lombardi's wife Marie was able to handle Lombardi's sometimes harsh personality better than anyone else he'd ever seen. Landry, of course, would later serve as the first head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, and the rivalry of him coaching the Giants' defense while Lombardi led their offense would get amplified years later when he was coaching Dallas and Lombardi was with the Packers. Lombardi moved his family from West Point to a new home in Oradell, New Jersey, where he'd watch game film. In his own words, he said he'd watch it until it began to drive Marie and the kids crazy and had to take it down to the basement. There he dissected players, saying, "On each play in every game, I'd run the projector back and forth 3 or 4 times with 7 or 8 people in mind, and then I'd run it back again to see what the 3 or 4 others were doing." He would use yellow notepads, writing down the important things he observed, later indexing to them for easier retrieval. As far as what he got from watching the Giants, Lombardi said, "The big point I realized was that whatever formation I used, I have to have a flaker back. You have to have the threat of a pass." He continued, "From pictures, my sense was the passing game was great and the running game only a half try. Everybody said you can't run much in the pros. Their defenses were too large and mobile to sustain a running game against them. I reasoned that the people we had on offense were every bit as big and every bit as mobile." After attending training camp at Willamette College in Salem, Oregon, and finally getting familiar with his players in person, Lombardi would later say, "I can still see the fluid motion Frank Gifford had while running the ball, the great hands Kyle Rote exhibited in catching it, and the anticipation Charlie Connolly had in releasing the ball." This trio would lead the way in the Giants dominating the East as they would close out the 1950s by appearing in 3 of the last 4 NFL championship games. Kyle Rote came to New York as a running back, however injuries to his legs moved him to receiver where he started flanker. Charlie Connolly, their quarterback, had so much trouble with protection that before Lombardi came to the team, he had evidently considered retirement. However, Coach Howe promised they would beef up the offensive line to give him more time in place. Frank Gifford was another player who had struggles before Lombardi's arrival. The Giants' previous coach, Steve Owen, wasn't quite sure what to do with Gifford due to his versatility, so he utilized him in a number of various positions, thus causing frustration from all the inconsistency of where he belonged. Lombardi, however, closely observed him on the game film and reached a decision before the two had even met. According to Gifford, the introduction began with him saying, "Hi, I'm Vince Lombardi, and you're my halfback." Gifford later reflected, "They were the most important words anybody ever said to me in football. I had never been anyone's halfback." Lombardi had already personally seen Gifford in college when Southern Cal defeated Army in 1951, and he recognized his potential. His son Vincent Jr. joined him at training camp where he cleaned cleats, acted as a ball boy, and carried water buckets. Vincent Jr. recalled, "My father would chew me out in front of everybody. He screamed that I didn't get the footballs, that I didn't do this or that." The tensest moment came when he was late to practice along with some players, and Coach Howe wanted Vincent Jr. to tell him which players were late. He refused, and Howe, irritated, dismissed him. He thought his father was going to be mad at him for this, but Lombardi, seeing the sense of loyalty his son displayed for the players, said it was actually the right decision. As with his first year at West Point, it took some time for the players to warm up to Lombardi. One has to remember during this time period, Lombardi was not viewed as a legend. No one was exalting him as one of the greatest coaches of all time. To many, despite his assistant job at West Point, he was just some guy. In fact, some Giant players had never even heard of him. To view it from their historical perspective, forget about how famous Lombardi is now. Instead, imagine some random person off the street who had never been in the NFL come to the Giants training camp, yelling at them and forcing them to work harder. This didn't sit well with everyone. You have to remember, too, that people like Charlie Connolly were veterans of World War II. Connolly himself was in the Battle of Guam and was nearly killed when this rifle was shot out of his hands. He was an established NFL veteran who went through things Lombardi never had, so this rookie coach rubbed many the wrong way, as people like him were kids. They didn't need someone to whip them into shape, they just needed some direction. Gifford writes, "After our training camp workouts, when many other players gathered at a local joint, everyone began doing imitations of Lombardi. The lack of respect that many players initially showed led him to one day walk out the door through the middle of a coaching session. You see, Lombardi was trying to open up the audible system, which the Giants called automatics, where colors were yelled out to signal a change of play. He viewed it as too limited, as there were only a small number of plays the quarterback could use when making a change, so he decided to expand it by using a much more complex numbering system. For example, the play had the number 41 in its name, and the defense moved a man to the middle of the defense, and the quarterback wanted to account for this and change it to play 49. He would yell at the number 8. Play 41 plus 8 equals 49. Play 49. One of the players protested and yelled out, wondering if they'd have to have adding machines. Lombardi grew angry and yelled, "You are without a doubt the dumbest bunch of supposed college graduates I've ever had the misfortune to be associated with in my life." He then left the room, supposedly with some players laughing. He, however, came back the next day, stating, "All right, for you dummies who can't add or subtract, we're going to make it easier for you." He then explained the change with the quarterback now calling the actual name of the audible. No math necessary. This seemed to work. One day, fullback Eddie Price experienced enough of Lombardi's demeanor and decided to quit right in the field. As he walked off to the locker room to pack his bags, Lombardi chased after him, begging him to come back. Price would eventually return to the team, but people who knew Lombardi would tease him later for following Price like a puppy. Quarterback Connolly's stoic attitude could come across as a sign of him not caring, even if he did, and this conflicted with Lombardi's approach that players should be animated and fired up. There was an option play where he had the choice of either giving to the fullback, giving the ball to the halfback, or running with the ball himself. The very nature of the play exposed Connerly to more hits and tackles, and one time in practice, after getting hit repeatedly, he threw the ball at Lombardi and said, "You want to run the goddamn play? You run it." Lombardi would later remove it from the playbook. While his choice to try to run Connerly may have been wrong, he did introduce rule blocking to the Giants, which was later adopted by other NFL teams. However, at the time, Lombardi said, "You had that first July that they didn't believe. When I first explained it, they looked at one another. What's he doing?" Lombardi would make efforts to get to know them better, in particular Rote, Gifford, and Connerly. He would visit them in their dorms and go over plays, asking them their opinions on whether or not they'd work. Gifford writes at first that ticked them off as they would sneak out after 11 o'clock at night to get some beers, and here was Lombardi blocking their way. Eventually, though, Lombardi would win over their respect when he said he was willing to take advice and really wanted to know what they thought. Gifford continues, "It was Lombardi, however, who rejuvenated a rapidly aging quarterback. For the first time in his career, he had a coach who was all offense and who gave him a running game that kept the other team sufficiently off balance to allow a passing game to succeed." After training camp was over, Lombardi invited some players back to his home in New Jersey, where his wife Marie made them spaghetti. When it came to the NFL passing game, Lombardi needed assistance in adjusting as his passing routes were too simplistic for quarterbacks capable of much more precision throwing against faster and better defensive backs. For this, he got the help of the Giants receiver coach. In 1954, the Giants would get off to a good start, posting a 6-3 record. However, Gifford and Connerly injuries derailed the momentum, and they finished 7-5. It was then in the offseason that Lombardi did something seemingly uncharacteristic. Well, uncharacteristic if you don't believe this was an act. So apparently he was feeling upset about his adjustment to the Giants. I thought things just weren't working out, and he wanted to return to the familiar assistant coaching spot under Red Blake at West Point. Lombardi approaches Blake and asks for his job back. Blake was surprised, but accepted him back with a verbal agreement. Then Blake, as a courtesy, called the Maras to tell them about Lombardi coming back to West Point. The Maras got upset because Lombardi did not bother to tell them about this. This leads to the Giants organization making overtures to keep Lombardi, including giving him a $6,000 raise. He goes back to Blake and tells him that he doesn't want to go back on his word, but with his wife Marie being upset over the prospect of turning down the big raise, it was difficult. Blake tells him to forget the arrangement and go back to the Giants. So was this a ploy for Lombardi to get more money, or was he being genuine in his actions? If you go by Blake's account, he believes he was being truthful. While suspicious, Lombardi had exhibited doubts before, and working in the NFL was not as prestigious as it is in modern times, and he did like working under Blake. It's possible it was both. Maybe he really did like the concept of going back to West Point, but he thought he would settle for the Giants if they financially made it worth his while. No definite conclusion can be drawn, but this action did increase his salary, making things easier on him and his family. In the 1955 draft, the Giants would add fullback Mel Triplett, defensive back Jim Patton, and defensive tackle Roosevelt Rosie Greer. And from the Canadian Football League, they would get fullback Alex Webster, and in trades, they received Harlan Sroué, and in 1956, they would get defensive end Andy Rebustelli and defensive tackle Dick Modzelewski. Despite positive changes, the 1955 season began with a 2-5 record. Howell asked for suggestions on how to fix things, and Lombardi and Ed Coleman, the line coach, suggested improving the running game by double blocking in the T formation. Teams then usually used brush blocking with the T, but their approach would be different, as at the point of attack where the runner would hit the hole, two players in the other team would both get double teamed. For example, 47 Power was a play designed to go to Gifford, the number 4 back, and he hit the number 7 hole, which is located between the tackle and the end. Ken McAfee and Dick Yelvington would both block the end, while Mel Triplett and Bill Austin would get the outside linebacker. While not always leading to a big run, picking up around 4 yards per carry would usually be enough to sustain a drive. In 1954, the team as a whole had averaged 3.9 yards per rush. In 1955, this would go up to 4.1 yards, but this doesn't tell the whole story as it changed and it happened until several games into the season. So it would seem like the new blocking schemes were the reason behind the turnaround. However, let's fact check this. If you calculate the running average for the first 7 games of 1955, assuming Pro Football's reference stats are accurate, The Giants averaged 4.08 yards per rush for their first 7 games. Then, with their 5-game turnaround, they averaged 4.08 yards again. Maybe this is due to the strength of the schedule. Well, up until week 6, every squad they faced finished with a losing record. In the final 5 games, however, there were 2 teams with winning records and 1 team just 1 game below 500, so this would seem to back that up. And you can see that their second game against the Cardinals seems to be an outlier, as when they faced them again, they only averaged 3.97 yards per carry, which rounds up to 4 yards. However, it's nowhere near as good as the 5.8 yards per carry they had during the first match. So if you exclude the 245-yard game as a fluke, in 6 games, they averaged 3.78 yards per carry. However, during the turnaround, they had 3 games when they averaged below 4 yards, and one of those was a horrendous game with a 2.87 yard average. But you could contend those low averages are due to facing better competition, except their worst game came against the 4-7-1 Eagles, and the Giants had actually averaged 4.09 yards per carry the first time they played them, before the blocking scheme switch supposedly occurred. In fact, of the 3 teams they played both before and after the apparent switch, the Giants only had a better game rushing the second time against the Browns. But as an overall reminder, this math is under the assumption the change took place when they were 2-5, and author O'Brien certainly seems to imply that, but the change could have taken place when they were still losing in week 6 or week 7. If that were the case, this would improve the calculations. However, I wasn't able to find a specific answer as to when it occurred. This shows football analytics is not an exact science. There are so many variables in the sport, and people understandably want to try to weed through the numbers to make sense of it all. So when there is a change in momentum, people ask why and look for what was different. And if something specific can be identified, it's listed as one of the reasons, even if it didn't play as big of a factor as people would like to believe. Back to Lombardi. He would like to fool the defense sometimes by doing a play maybe 10 times, but then when the defense got used to it, he called one that started off just like that one, but with a change to fool them. For example, Gifford mentioned 36 slant, which was a running play to Mel Triplett where Gifford would go to block the linebacker. Then, after this was run several times, Gifford, instead of going for the linebacker, would run around him and end up taking a pass from Connolly. And teams would copy some of his plays, and when Lombardi saw this in the film sessions, he'd say, "Look at that. Look at what they're doing with that. They got that from us. They stole our play." Of course, if Lombardi stole a play from another team, there was nothing wrong at all with that. He was just being creative. Years later, Henry Jordan said that Lombardi was the least prejudiced man and that he treats everyone the same, like dogs. Gifford strongly disagreed, noting that Lombardi knew the importance of paying attention to the different types of personalities the players had and what different approaches worked best for each person. In fact, earlier in this documentary, I mentioned a quote from Lombardi himself where he directly stated just that. Despite the mediocre overall record of 1955, the Giants and the NFL were about to hit it big. CBS reached an agreement to nationally televise games in 1956, and Sports Illustrated would also start covering them on a regular basis. The increase of media exposure, especially through television, would soon make the Giants a team in the public's consciousness. The Giants would also be switching stadiums, moving from the Polo Grounds to Yankee Stadium, and as the Giants continued to improve, their attendance blew up. As in 1955, 163,787 tickets were sold for their home games. In 1956, this would balloon to 280,727. This was an increase of almost 117,000 in just one single season. Training camp for the 1956 season was at St. Michael's College in Winooski, Vermont. Despite Coach Howell coming across as a mere delegator to some, he could be tough on players too. For example, the rookie Sam Huff said Coach Howell would push players to their physical limit and beyond, but he didn't know when to stop. Lombardi, however, did, and in Huff's mind, this is part of what separated the two. Huff elaborated on Lombardi by saying he was the Giants' offensive coach that year, and he knew when to let a man breathe. Howell never knew how to do that. He never knew how to build a player back up. Well, it was here that Huff and kicker Don Chandler were in their dorm listening to a country station. Huff was having an uneasy training camp, and one of the reasons was that he seemed to be too small to be in the line when compared to bigger NFL players. While they were both airing their woes, Huff said that if the song Detroit City came on, which included the line, "I want to go home," that would be a sign that they should leave, and sure enough, it did. So Huff and Chandler go to Lombardi to turn in the playbooks and tell him they were leaving. Lombardi got angry and said, "We got 2 weeks invested in you guys. You may not make this ball club, but you're sure as hell not quitting on me." Chandler then leaves to pack his bags. However, Huff acquiesced, but when he met with Chandler shortly after, he's talked into quitting once more. They drive to the airport and Lombardi tracks them down and drives them back to camp. At least that's the story that's commonly told. Sam Huff, however, has a version that's slightly different. After he told Lombardi he was quitting, he went back to his room and there was a knock on the door. It was his line coach, Ed Coleman. Coleman spoke with him and he was the one that changed his mind. This account comes from Sam Huff's book, Controlled Violence. If Huff's account is accurate, it paints an interesting picture because he mentioned that when he initially quit, that was the first time he had ever seen Lombardi get mad.
Sudden burst of anger, if you will. But he wasn't that way with us. He was, later got to be that way in Green Bay. Paul Horning is a good friend of mine and was a good friend of mine then. He went to Notre Dame, I went to FC, and we knew each other. He used to tell me, "What kind of madman did you send us?"
It was instead Coach Howell who was causing the strain. So Huff goes to the airport still wanting to stay and simply being with Chandler because he wanted company. However, by the time they were at the airport, Chandler must have talked Huff again into quitting or at least being up in the air about it, as Huff states that after Lombardi cut up with them, we both decided to give it another try. Huff would end up having success in the NFL as he was moved to linebacker to deal with a smaller size, and Chandler would end up eventually in Green Bay where he would play an important role with the Packers in the 1960s. During practice, Huff said the defense would dominate the offense, and this would lead to Lombardi getting angry and screaming and keeping the offense on the field long after the defense hit the showers. Is this true? This would appear to be an exaggeration. However, there is a notable discrepancy in how the Giants' defense on offense fared compared to the rest of the NFL. Huff and Lombardi's time with the Giants overlapped from 1956 to 1958. In that first year, the Giants led the league with fewest yards allowed. Their offense, however, was 7th in total yards in a league that only had 12 teams. In 1957, both the offense and defense placed 4th in the yards tally. However, in 1958, the offense fell to 10th place while the defense stayed at 4th. Now, if you go by total points, the picture becomes more even. However, in 1958, the defense allowed the fewest points in the NFL, while the Giants' offense was in 9th place in scoring. And once again, this was in the league with just 12 teams. So it seems like there might have been something to what Huff said. However, the degree of accuracy is in question. The Giants would end up winning 6 of their first 7 games on their way to the 1956 NFL Championship game against the Chicago Bears in a match where everything went wrong for Chicago and everything seemed to go right for the Giants as they manhandled them 47-7. Before the game, the field had iced over, so the Giants got cleats from player Robustelli, who had a sporting goods store. They then had one player running cleats and the other in sneakers, and when it was reported that they couldn't get traction with the cleats, the switch to sneakers was made. The Bears, however, didn't make this pregame change, and this was in part the reason credited as to why the Giants dominated the game so much. Lombardi's wife Marie knew she had to deal with how much football dominated her husband's life, and she tried to adapt by going to all the home games. It was there that she would bring their daughter Susan. However, instead of Susan getting to watch the games, Marie would pay a female bathroom attendant to look after her in the ladies' room, as Susan would periodically hand out towels to the people coming in. This separation from the game led to Susan not fully understanding what her father even did. In terms of Lombardi's own father, Harry, he was proud of his son's rise in the sport and became one of his biggest cheerleaders. A heart attack slowed Harry down. However, chopping wood was his way of relieving stress. And when his doctor saw this and said that he shouldn't be doing this, Harry fainted with his axe and yelled, "Don't tell me what I'm supposed to do." Not surprisingly, Harold, Lombardi's brother, said his cardiologists were afraid to death of him. Rather than viewing his coaching strategy as a cumulative effort of acquiring knowledge over the years, Lombardi, at least in one 1956 interview, said, "Every single thing I learned from the 1930s had gone out the window. Even in the last 5 years, football has changed tremendously." And looking back at the big changes, such as the continued proliferation of the passing game, the changing defensive formations to deal with this passing game, and players now playing just an offense or just defense, this seemed to be a pretty apt description. Of course, when it came to motivating players, some things are timeless. However, the overall strategy of the game grew further and further away from the version he played as a young man. Speaking of adapting, Lombardi continued to be open to suggestions from players. Lineman Jack Stroud said it wasn't easy to convince Lombardi, but if he could prove you were right about something, he'd change it. This was not a coach consumed with too much ego to admit that he was wrong. When it came time to film analysis, Lombardi, of course, would continue to pore over it, and it was during this time that the Giants and the Rams agreed to exchange game film. The Rams had recently played Chicago, and the Giants would soon face them, so the Rams gave them the footage they had, and to pay back the favor, the Giants gave them footage they had against their match against the Eagles, who Los Angeles was about to play. Lombardi, of course, had a reputation for being stern, but he could occasionally crack up. Gifford remembered one day in practice while drills were being run, the rest of the players started to get bored because they didn't have anything to do. Well, they would naturally crowd closer and closer to the players doing the drill, and this led to Lombardi getting mad and telling them to back up. Some players thought Lombardi's reaction was funny, so some of them got closer a second time just to mess with him. This continued until Lombardi saw an old orange pill that had been laying on the grass. So Lombardi said, "Everyone behind the orange pill. Anyone who passes the orange pill gets a lap around the field." This led to the players lining up single file behind the orange pill in a further effort to mess with him. Each time Lombardi wasn't looking, they would push the orange pill closer and closer to him. Finally, when they were right by him, he turned around and said, "I told you guys to get behind the orange." And then he looked down and saw the orange pill right by him. This finally broke him, causing him to laugh. Now, there is one note I wanted to make about his temper. Earlier in the documentary, while recounting his time as a high school teacher, one former student said stories about Lombardi throwing erasers probably wasn't true because he never seen him do it. But here with the Giants, it was said this was something he would do, so apparently there was some truth to that. Lombardi would try to sometimes needle players in an effort to motivate them to do better. For example, in one game, Mel Triplett, their fullback, had missed a block. So while watching game film of this, Lombardi repeatedly got after Triplett, making him mad until Triplett said, "Get off my back or get yourself another fullback." Lombardi didn't respond and continued on with the rest of the film. After the film session was over, Lombardi said to Jack Stroud, "I meant to make him mad, but I didn't want to make him that mad." Evidently, Lombardi and Triplett wouldn't have any other issues after that. The one player Lombardi seemed not to criticize too harshly was their quarterback, Connerly. Lombardi respected his toughness. In one game, Connerly had broken his nose, and instead of coming out, he stayed on the field while the trainers tried to push his nose back into place. Despite his sometimes volatile personality, Lombardi earned the respect of many of his players, including Gifford, who said that he had a bigger impact in his life than perhaps his own father. Although to Gifford, Lombardi wasn't anything like the legend. He said he was actually one of the most down-to-earth people, and he never called him Coach or Mr. Lombardi. To him, he was just Vince. After their 1956 championship, the press was really paying attention to the team, and Lombardi was finally getting some attention from the media for his coaching. The reaction and opinion of him was a mixed bag. Some of the press liked him, but others, like Jerry Eisenberg of the New York Herald Tribune, said Lombardi was a horrible, dreadful man in the dressing room. This was allegedly due to Lombardi not handling questions well that he thought were stupid. Eisenberg said that if you asked him about a strategy, he gave a detailed, specific answer. However, if you asked him why he threw in third down, he might say something that had to be censored. Despite the Giants doing well in the late 50s, Lombardi was not satisfied as he still longed for a head coaching job that had been denied him for so long. Head coach Howell, who would write recommendations for him, offered some insight, saying, mostly he thought he should have been somewhere else. Every year he would come up with about 6 teams that he wanted to go coach right then. As early as late 1954, Lombardi tried to get a head coaching job at Fordham, as Coach Danowski had resigned. Lombardi went as far as negotiating a salary arrangement with Jack Coffey. However, on December 15th, Fordham's president released a statement saying they were ending the football program due to financial concerns. Another one of the institutions Lombardi turned his attention to was the Catholic University Notre Dame. They had fired their head coach after the 1956 season. However, according to Lombardi, they never even acknowledged the letter he sent them. Howell continued, "He told me several times he'd like to have that job." He also looked at the Air Force Academy in Colorado. Lombardi's friend, Tim Cohen, had talked to the superintendent recommending him. However, Buck Shaw, who apparently had already been in talks to coach there, had decided to take the job, leaving Lombardi once again to keep searching. He also supposedly applied to Southern California, Washington, and Stanford. His friend, Tim Cohen, recounted a conversation he had with him. "I'm wondering whether the right head coaching job will ever open up for me. I know I can coach, but the right people never seem to know it. You'll get your chance. It's bound to come. I hope you're right, but I'll be 43 in June, and I'm not getting any younger." After the 1957 season ended, one team did come calling, the Philadelphia Eagles. They had recently fired their head coach, and so Vince McNally, the Eagles' general manager, called Lombardi and asked him for an interview. Lombardi, enthusiastic, agreed, and they met at a Philadelphia train depot. Instead of playing his cards close to his vest, Lombardi supposedly told McNally, "This is the first chance I've ever received to be a head coach." The interview went well, and the Eagles offered him the job. McNally said, "He was just like a little kid. He was so happy to get a head coaching job." There was just one problem. The Eagles, due to issues with their stockholders, couldn't offer Lombardi a long contract as they had been displeased with their previous fired coach having to get paid for a third season. So Lombardi, if he took the spot, would have no guaranteed long-term stability. Furthermore, he wouldn't have any real creative control. Out of respect to the Maras, Lombardi told them about the job, and they said just as much. So Lombardi reached out to his wife Marie, who told him to sit in church and really think about the situation. Don't pray, think. Later, Lombardi would meet with Wellington Mara again, and he told him he thought he was right. The Maras gave him a raise, and he stayed with the Giants. Pat Summerall, the kicker for the 1958 season, had arrived much later than many of the other players, so it's interesting to see his perspective on Lombardi. As he writes, he was someone that no one questioned, which could have been further from the truth back in 1954. Summerall instead seems to have viewed Lombardi in a similar way to how the media did, which goes to show how legends are often not an instantaneous creation, but instead take time, and a person's perspective on how much they buy into the legend can depend on how early in the story they were present. The 1958 season would start off slow for New York, with them splitting their first 4 games. However, they turned it around, but in order to win the East, they would have to get past the Cleveland Browns and their young second-year sensation running back Jim Brown. Brown had exploded into the NFL scene the year prior, taking what was a mediocre Browns club after quarterback Otto Graham retired and taking them to the 1957 NFL championship game. They would end up being defeated by the Lions, so in 1958, they were looking to get back to the championship, but this time with a win, and the New York Giants stood in their way. While this game was important to Cleveland, it was even more important to Lombardi and the Giants, as the Browns were one spot above them. So Cleveland, unlike the Giants, could win the East simply by having a tie. Nothing short of a victory for New York, however, would suffice. It was do or die. Well, in the snow, late in the game, and tied at 10, the Giants are unable to move the ball and end up with a 4th and 10. So, unexpectedly, they bring in their kicker, Pat Summerall. Not only was this a gamble due to the distance of 50 yards, but it was also risky because of the snow. Despite this, Summerall connects with the ball dead center and kicks it through their uprights for a win, keeping the Giants' season alive and setting up a playoff game rematch with Cleveland the following week. As Summerall left the field, Lombardi smiled and said, "You know, don't you, that you can't kick it that far." The following week, the Giants' defense was able to contain Jim Brown, leading to the Giants' 10-0 victory, signaling them to the 1958 NFL championship game. This time, they would be facing the Baltimore Colts. This would be the very first overtime game in NFL history, despite the fact the league started play in 1920. To explain how it took so long, we have to first look at the history of the playoffs and the rules of that time period. Back then, overtime did not exist in the regular season. If the score was tied at the end of regulation, that was simply just a tie. Instead, only playoff games could have extra periods, but even though the NFL had playoffs since 1932, the rule was normally only one single playoff game would be played each year, the NFL championship. That was unless a tiebreaker game was necessary. Under these conditions, prior to the 1958 NFL championship game, there had been only 34 total opportunities for overtime to even occur. Just 34, or the equivalent of 2 full modern NFL seasons as of this recording. So while an overtime championship game would still be a big deal now, this was the first ever in the history of the league in any context, so that amped up the spectacle. Late in the game, the Giants had a 17-14 lead. Gifford recounts that they had 4th down on their own 43. Most of the team wanted to go for it, including Lombardi, but Coach Howell made the call to punt because of the strength of their defense. As Gifford said, it wasn't a bad call, it just turned out to be the wrong call. So they gave the ball back to the Colts, and their quarterback Johnny Unitas drove his team down the field for the tying field goal. The game goes into sudden death, and the Colts get the ball and march out of the field again, this time for a touchdown. Colts 23, Giants 17. And further demonstrating that Lombardi could have empathy, after the loss, he went up to Gifford, who had fumbled twice, put his arm around him and said, "Don't take it so hard, Frank, because we wouldn't have gotten here without you." While the season ended in disappointment, Lombardi was busy afterward looking for some supplemental income during the off-season. He got a job at the Federation Bank and Trust Company at Columbus Circle, New York. However, he was only there 3 weeks before another possible head coaching job came up, this time at West Point as Red Blake was retiring. However, as noted earlier, Blake, instead of choosing Lombardi, decided to go with another member of his current staff, and when Lombardi heard of this, he decided to pick up and call someone else. There was one more potential job opening at this time, as he had been contacted by another organization that was very interested in hearing from him, the Green Bay Packers. Gifford, who still kept in contact with Lombardi, said he thought Lombardi would become the head coach after Coach Howe retired. However, Lombardi didn't want to wait around forever, and he didn't know that he would end up leaving so soon. The Maras, having now lost both Lombardi and Landry, who had gone to coach the Cowboys, talked Howe into coaching one more year. There was talk in the press of maybe Lombardi getting out of his contract with the Green Bay. However, there was one popular candidate who stood in the way, Allie Sherman, the new Giants assistant coach. According to Gifford, he had lunch with Lombardi right after Vince met with Pete Rozelle, the NFL commissioner, where he learned the status of his contract. There was a movement in the media to point out that if players couldn't break their contracts with teams, why should they let coaches do this? Lombardi was convinced Sherman was behind this, although Gifford wasn't sure of the accuracy of this. Years later, when Gifford was interviewing Lombardi for NFL Films, he told Lombardi, "Too bad you could have done this in New York." Lombardi looked sad and said, "Frank, I'll always be convinced I could have accomplished exactly the same things with the Giants. My greatest regret is that I didn't get the chance." That's all for now. Next time, we'll discuss the actual hiring process of how Lombardi landed the job with the Packers, the off-season and training camp leading up to his first season, and the immediate impact he had on the franchise that seemed lost and directionless, but would soon, under Lombardi's leadership, make one of the biggest turnarounds and become the most dominating team in the entire country. See you next time.